Welcome to our event, which is LGBTI and feminist movements, pushing back against the pushback. We have an excellent panel here who I will introduce as they speak. But this event has been sponsored by a cross-section of feminist civil society organizations, as well as the UN LGBTI core group, and many who have contributed to organize this discussion, so thank you. We are very excited to hear from Victor Madrigal Bolos, and I'm so excited once again to be with him on a panel. It's always a pleasure. We know at the 76th session of the UN General Assembly, the independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination on sexual orientation and gender identity, Victor, delivered his annual report in the third committee titled Practices of Exclusion. The report analyzed the backlash against the incorporation of gender frameworks in international human rights law, including the experiences of LGBTI human rights defenders and the exclusion of trans and non-binary individuals by anti-gender actors. This report followed the SOGI IE's first report delivered earlier this year at the 74th session of the Human Rights Council, which concluded that international human rights law supports an inclusionary approach. It's going to be very exciting to hear from Victor for the next 10 minutes, but just as a way of quick introduction, apart from his official status, which he began on January 1st, 2018, and he's the second independent expert to serve in this capacity. He's a Costa Rican jurist and is a senior visiting researcher at the Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program in residence at Harvard Law School from July 2019 to December 2020.
Thank you very much, Tita. And a warm greeting to you. It had been a while since we last saw each other, so I wish I can convey through the screen with as much emotion as I can how excited it is that I am to see you, as well as the dear friends and respected colleagues that are part of this panel. Thank you so much for having invited me to this conversation. In effect, already 2.5 years ago, when I began the consultations for the plan of work of the mandate for the period 2021-2023, a consultation in which over 500 individuals, organizations, and states participated, two main conclusions could be drawn from the input received from all corners of the globe. One of them is that the mandate needed to reach further into root causes of violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, reaching into topics such as the impact of colonialism and the relationship with freedom of religion and belief, which is part of what my current research agenda is. And the other one was that in order to fulfill the mandate of giving visibility to the way in which violence and discrimination occurs in the everyday lives of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and gender diverse persons, it was necessary to carry out an academic inquiry into the reception of the concept of gender and the inextricably connected concepts of gender identity, gender expression in international human rights law. As you know, Gita, in the last decade, with stronger force, there has been the representation of a trend that started already in the 80s and 90s, and that has been very much part of the concern of feminisms around the globe. And that is this constant idea to withdraw the notion of gender from the political, ethical, and action language of international organizations and international commitments. And this aspiration that the mandate would be part of this effort of carrying out inquiry in relation to this issue got, of course, coupled and stood in the shoulder of giants, or perhaps I should say giantesses, that preceded this work, including, of course, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, at that time in Law and Practice, and many, many, many of the activists coming from feminisms around the globe. This work, as I said, Kita, builds on the stands on the shoulders, so to speak, of this great work that has been carried out undoubtedly since the 80s and 90s in creating and recognizing the importance of gender-based frameworks for the furtherance of the analysis of violence and discrimination at international level, and in which the mandate has been benefiting since day one, as you know, Gita, from the advice of the voices, the lived experience, and the knowledge of women around the globe. It was important for me to leave what ended up being a mix of an intellectual and an emotional finding, which is that this report aims at reflecting the voices of women. In that aspect, as we know, gender theory-informed approaches recognize that the meanings attached to sex and other differences in relations to social roles and behaviors and expectations are all socially created. And these approaches also challenge the assumption that gender identity necessarily correlates with biological sex, and recognize the validity of a wide range of sexual orientations and gender identities. The recognition of gender as determined by social construct is, of course, common to many feminisms, as well as queer or LGBT theory, as is the recognition that gender, sex, and sexuality interconnect with other axes of identity and organizations of power and identification, such as race and age and ethnicity and religion, disability and health status, amongst others. These approaches are fundamental to the mandate from two axes of work. One of them is, as you know, one of the genius of the resolution that provides for my mandate, and I have no merit in this because I had nothing to do with that, so I just acknowledge it, is that I am mandated to work within intersectionality. And what I have learned of feminisms that have explored the way that social constructs interact with freedom of persons from pretty much from birth, and of course, determining the fate based on the intersection of these different identities. And I was mentioning that I believe one of the genius aspects of the resolution that provides my mandate is that it is required to work within intersectionality, that recognition that we all reunite many identities in one body, and that it is the compounded effect of those identities in one place and one time, perhaps varying inclusive in relation to space and time, that creates particular experiences of privilege or violence and discrimination and exclusion. And that analysis must recognize that sexual orientation and gender identity are, on one hand, necessary points of entry into this analysis, but on the other hand, only a point of entry that must acknowledge the intersectional realities of lived experience. Now, my inquiry, resulting from the wide consultation that I carried out and that led me to conclude that it was necessary to carry out that inquiry, began by an interest in doing a legal analysis of the reception or incorporation of gender-based frameworks under international human rights law. But as you know, Gita and dear colleagues in the panel, the level of interest and the massive response to my call for inputs led me to understand that the topic was a lot more wide-reaching and that it was necessary to devote not only one, but two reports to the issue. And I took the deliberate decision of exploring two dimensions of international political, ethical narratives in relation to this issue. One was the core legal analysis of the incorporation of gender-based frameworks in international human rights law, and the other one, if you will, the antithesis to that premise, which is the exclusionary narratives that basically, in my conclusions, represent basically a counterpoint to international rule of law. My first report, and that's why I always present them in a correlative stage, because to me, these are very much part of a dynamic. I don't want to say two sides of the coin because I don't care for financial analogies, but I'm going to say clearly a thesis and antithesis in the world of international relations and the world of human rights. The first part of my report, in which I won't dwell at this moment, but just to state it, followed the structure of analysis of the creation of international human rights law under Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, and inquired whether gender-based frameworks and the inextricably connected concepts of gender, gender identity, gender expression had undergone such a process of formation of international human rights law. And the answer was a resounding yes. There is robust evidence to the effect that gender-based frameworks and the concepts of gender identity, amongst others, have become part of this framework and have been acknowledged as necessary points of entry in the analysis of violence and discrimination, and of course, of the connected states' responses to it. Narratives and practices of exclusion, on the other hand, explores then the narratives and the attempts to exclude such concepts from the recognition of international law, a process that, Gita, is not necessarily explored in legal theory to the extent that would have given me a good premise to work, because there is no counter Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice. There are ways to understand how international human rights law is formed, but there's not necessarily a process describing how international human rights law is deconstructed. And this should provide us a key. There is no process to de-recognize the furtherance of human rights. There is a recognition that the process of formation of international human rights law is of such solidity and weighed with such counters and balances that deconstructing recognition of human rights is a process that actually is theoretically, practically, and ethically impossible. What is it then that anti-gender or anti-gender identity narratives do? They cannot follow a process of political, ethical, or legal discussion of deconstruction, because there is not such a thing. There is not a process under international law to de-recognize progress in the furtherance of human rights. So my inquiry focused in the narratives as they are presented, and I have recognized a number of patterns that are common to all practices and narratives that constitute this backlash against the incorporation of gender frameworks in international human rights law. Exclusionary narratives and actions related to gender and gender identity all exploit preconception, stigma, and prejudice. They rely on the notion and the reality of certain catchphrases and speaking points that evoke notions of moral panic or global conspiracy, and that constitute basket narratives in which you will find a number of different claims, all of which actually are not necessarily coherent with each other, except for the fact that they evoke notions such as the past was always better, tradition must be defended even when it means violence against women and oppression, and family is, of course, constituted in a way that it's heteronormative and absolutely predetermined according to patriarchal models. As you know, Gita, and I'm not really able to go in depth into all of the findings of the report, but as you know, the report is roughly divided in two great sections. One of them is the questionings to the incorporation of gender, which again, from the standpoint of a legal departure and then amplifying to political and social narratives and analysis, I find has no grounding under international human rights law. And then moving on to the questioning of gender identity as part of the constructs in international human rights law, something that I actually find quite puzzling, because as you know, my mandate has now reached the conclusion that every person on earth who lives in gendered societies has taken decisions, positions, or not, has been influenced in the alternative by the way gender impacts their life. And given that I have found no evidence that there are people who live in societies that are not gendered, then my conclusion is that everybody possesses gender identity and therefore must be protected from discrimination that is based on it. Finally, Gita, the report analyzes certain spheres that constitute, in my view, a playbook that has been drafted and follows him, and follows quite importantly and quite coherently in relation to these strategies, and they relate to the alleged threat of the rights of women, the alleged threat to participation of women in different sectors of life, including sports, and the threat of rights to children. And I examine those and conclude that they have, in my view, little grounding under a rights-based analysis. Gita, thank you so much for your flexibility and patience. I realized that I went a little bit off kilter, but I wanted to make sure that I recaptured kind of the energy after our technical glitch. You've been very kind, and of course, I look forward to the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Victor. And I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion once we've heard from also our panelists, and we are moving things along so that we do keep enough time for a conversation amongst you, and then of course a Q&A at the end. So we're going to move right to the panelists with two sets of questions. But before I kind of introduce the questions, I want to quickly introduce the four panelists. I'm not going to read out the longer bios because everyone has a long bio. They've had long experiences and long lives. But I want to be able to say at least one or two critical things about each person. Mauro Cabral Greenspan, I also want to try to say everyone's name correctly, is an activist and researcher from Argentina, and is a co-founder and the executive director of GAY since 2017. And it's been an honor to work and learn from Mauro over the years on so many different issues. So I'm so excited that Mauro is here. We're going to put everyone's bios in the chat, so the audience will get to see your full bios. We then have Alba Rueda, who is the Undersecretary for Diversity Policies at the Ministry of Women, Gender and Diversity of the Argentine Republic. So welcome, Alba. It's very exciting to be hearing from you as well. We also have Ambassador Gruttenhaus, who is very, very well known to many of us because, as you all know, works with the the government of the Dutch government, who is the ambassador for women's rights and gender equality, and we hope many more governments had those kind of ambassadors. The Dutch government has been a big supporter of many organizations that do this work all over the world, including my own CRIA. Last but not the least, we have Reem Al Salem, who's the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. I'm not sure if I need to say anything more about that, because you play an important role in on this issue and working with many women's movements, feminist movements all over the world. Welcome, panelists. What I wanted to do was to begin with Mauro. And of course, these questions are not watertight. So it's not like if I ask Mauro something, Reem can't say something about it. But just, we wanted to begin with thinking about 2 or 3 examples of how gender is being deployed in diverse attacks, especially against people who are sexual and gender diverse, maybe from your context or from the point of view of constituencies. What I want to be able to do is ask, 2 or 3 sets of questions. So maybe 2-3 minutes, 3-4 minutes on each, and then I'll move on to each person. So Mauro, do you want to begin, please?
Sure. Thank you very much, Gita, and everyone for the invitation to be here and for being here with us. Because we are delayed with time, I will try to have like a brief answer to your question and to refer to 3 kinds of attacks that anti-gender movements are perpetrated, particularly against trans and gender diverse people. So the first one of these attacks is the affirmation that being trans or gender diverse is a pathology in itself. And this means that trans and gender diverse people should be treated or cured through methods that include conversion therapies. Actually, anti-gender movements affirms that people can get the disorder of being trans and intersex, but being exposed to information on trans and gender diverse people, and actually also to being exposed to trans and gender diverse people themselves. There is the affirmations that we are contagious, that people can get this disorder of being a trans or gender diverse person, and that these particularly affect children and teenagers. And of course, it has a rolling effect on their families, supporting them, and the professionals providing access to healthcare. There is the idea that there is an epidemic converting cis people into trans people, and therefore that trapped inside every trans person, there is a cis person waiting for liberation. Pathologization has an impact in a right to exercise autonomy and self-determination when it comes to be about our identities, but also about our very capacity to provide informed consent to gender-affirming procedures. As a consequence, anti-gender movements are advocating to restrict or deny access to legal gender recognition and to transitional healthcare based on human rights standards. And this kind of particular advocacy is undermining the universality of human rights because it defends the perspective that certain human rights are entitled to fewer human rights just because they happen to be trans or gender diverse. And it also considers that certain human rights violations, such as pathologization, conversion therapies, or sterilizations, are acceptable when those violations are perpetrated against trans and gender diverse people. Finally, I want to say that, and this is like extremely serious and concerning, anti-gender movements are creating and spreading a climate of fear and hate. Using scaremongering as a key tactic, these movements are promoting the idea that we are dangerous to other people. And as a direct consequence, it is becoming socially and institutionally, even at the human rights, international human rights level, to question or even deny our access to very basic rights, such as the access to public bathrooms, to shelters, to services focused on protecting victims of gender violence. We see these practices being defended by traditional media, through social media and through the spread of disinformation and misinformation. And these practices are justifying stigma, discrimination, and violence against communities that already been traumatized. Thank you.
Great, Mauro, thanks a lot. That's a lot of things to think about. I want to move to Alba, and we asked Mauro to talk about how gender is deployed from within a context or from a constituency. Would you be willing to talk about how it might be deployed through a political policy or in a legislative space? And maybe that will be the same question I might have for Ambassador Gruttenhaus. So Alba, go ahead.
Bien, muy buenos días a todos, muchísimas gracias por esta invitación, muy buenos días, y quisiera particularmente reconocer la labor del experto independiente sobre la protección contra las violencias y discriminación por motivos de orientación sexual e identidad de género, y resaltar la importancia de que se sigan creando y mejorando los espacios técnicos especializados dentro de Naciones Unidas. Es un gustazo haber podido leer el documento que Víctor promueve, provoca, nos lleva a una reflexión y sobre todo un compromiso concreto acerca de la responsabilidad de los estados frente a la violencia y la discriminación. En ese sentido, me parece fundamental también poder mostrar que en Latinoamérica, en nuestro país, en Argentina, estamos impulsando políticas públicas que permiten la protección y que esto de las personas LGBTIQ+, y que esto no es una anécdota digamos, de los últimos meses, sino más bien es una posición de gobierno que se viene desarrollando a lo largo de los años con el fortalecimiento de las organizaciones y de los movimientos sociales. Ley de matrimonio igualitario, ley de identidad de género, la ley de cupo laboral travesti trans en Argentina, son, digamos, marcos normativos que permiten hablar sobre todo de esto, ¿no? De un reconocimiento y un arco de derechos que se va instalando a lo largo de los años. Nuestra primera ley sale en el 2010 y a partir de entonces se han desarrollado una serie de marcos normativos que permiten también hablar del reconocimiento a la identidad de género como un principio ineludible dentro de nuestras democracias. En ese sentido, quisiera destacar que con la creación del Ministerio de las Mujeres, Géneros y Diversidad en el año 2019, a finales del año 2019, lo que nos ha permitido es ahondar en prácticas de políticas públicas. Yo creo que aquí viene el complemento perfecto para lo que significa un compromiso, un reconocimiento del Estado de nuestros derechos, que tiene que ver principalmente con la protección y la promoción de los derechos. Por un lado, quisiera generar algunos compromisos también en un espacio como este, acerca de las líneas de política pública que nuestra subsecretaría, que nuestro ministerio desarrolla en torno a estos temas. Por un lado, continuar desarrollando estándares respecto al reconocimiento efectivo de la identidad de género, incluyendo especialmente a todas las identidades, las no binarias también. En Argentina, a partir de este año, con el decreto 476, hemos roto la estructura binaria de registro para nuestro país, y eso significa también un desafío más grande y un recorrido en torno al reconocimiento de las identidades no binarias. Pero esto no puede terminar solamente en un marco formal de derechos, sino también en el reconocimiento estatal, para que esto no tenga que ver con requisitos que vulneren la voluntad de las personas, que el reconocimiento legal de la identidad de género en las instituciones se tiene que hacer efectivo en los registros civiles y no solo en el documento de identidad, sino también en todo el proceso. Que no, esto por supuesto tiene que ver con el reconocimiento del derecho al trato digno, y conforme a la ley de identidad de género, todos los operadores del Estado deben estar también resguardando el libre desarrollo personal, especialmente en niñas, niños y adolescentes. Lo que quiero traducir es que para nosotras las políticas públicas de hacer efectiva la ley de identidad de género todavía es un ejercicio que se tiene que sostener cotidianamente. Y así como esto, quisiera también asumir otros indicadores que tienen que ver con las políticas públicas que estamos desarrollando, sobre todo en los estándares de los derechos humanos para las personas travestis y trans migrantes migrantes en contextos de movilidad forzada. Esto es uno de los puntos fundamentales para poder hablar de la protección específica, para garantizar el tránsito seguro, no solamente entre fronteras, sino también dentro de nuestro país, el reconocimiento de las identidades de las personas travestis y trans y no binarias para las personas migrantes. Y así, por supuesto, trabajar en uno de los ejes más fuertes de nuestra, que sucede para las personas trans en Argentina, que tiene que ver con la criminalización a partir del uso también de leyes punitivas, como por ejemplo el tema de estupefacientes. Para eso nosotras tenemos que trabajar profundamente en la desestigmatización y así también en la promoción de derechos. Menciono dos y concluyo aquí. Por un lado, también desarrollar estándares para asegurar el libre ejercicio y efectivo ejercicio de los derechos por parte de las personas trans privadas de su libertad. Esto es uno de los puntos que va, por supuesto, encausados dentro de lo que es la migración de las personas y la criminalización. Trabajar, por supuesto, en una justicia transfeminista y así también desarrollar estándares para asegurar otro de los aspectos que creo que vamos a resguardar y vamos a hablar acerca de nuestras democracias. Tiene que ver con la representatividad política y la participación efectiva de personas LGBT dentro de la toma de decisiones. Esto me parece que no solamente incluye leyes, prácticas institucionales, sino también un compromiso por parte de los movimientos políticos, de los partidos políticos en nuestro país, para resguardar el principio de representatividad de todas, todos y todes. Bueno, me quedo aquí sabiendo que este es un tiempo acotado, pero quería reaccionar frente a cuestiones que hacen a la propuesta. Muchísimas gracias, gracias Víctor, gracias a todos, gracias a Mauro también. Es un gustazo compartir con ustedes esta jornada. Gracias.
So we are going to move after we really deconstruct, go deeper into how gender is deployed, to build on what Victor said, to really some of the examples about how this is getting addressed through cross-movement work or alliance building in the next section. But I still want to continue on asking the same question from our ambassador, which is, again, how is gender being deployed in the political policy and legislative spaces? And Reem, I have the same question, so that then kind of it gives us a more holistic, from many different angles. And then we move on in the next section to examples. Go ahead, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. And I will not try to make the points that were made by the previous excellent speakers already. But good morning, good afternoon, buenos dias. I think, as Victor just said earlier, gender-based inequalities have been pervasive throughout history. And rather than getting better, the predicament has deteriorated. And tomorrow's outlook actually isn't promising, as global pressure on women's rights, gender equality, sexual reproductive health and rights, and equal rights of LGBTIQ persons have strongly increased, both at the national level and international level. And we risk that decades of progress are being reversed. It might actually be worse, because the pushback on women and girls, it also hampers progress on the 2030 agenda that we agreed on. So each and every goal we have committed to are all jeopardized if equal rights are not guaranteed. And I will give you an example, because it plays in the UN, but it also plays out in Europe. We have the Istanbul Convention that I'm sure you all are very much aware of, but the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence is the most far-reaching legal instrument to prevent and combat violence against women and domestic violence. And we have a lot of discussion about it. The very fact that convention has the term gender in it explained as socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for women and men, is enough reason for certain member states not to sign or ratify the convention. There have been constitutional court cases on this topic in multiple member states. For example, in Bulgaria, where constitutional courts claimed that the Istanbul Convention introduces a hidden gender ideology that teaches people they can choose their identity in contradiction to their biological sex. And a phrase that has been used by many conservative politicians and activists across Europe to redefine reforms that would benefit women and LGBTI people as the imposition of a system of beliefs that threatens the traditional family and corrupts society. And we see this happening in the national level. For example, if you look at the pushback on SRHR in Uganda, as well as regional and international level. And I can tell you that even in the Netherlands, we sometimes have discussion with strong religious political parties in the Netherlands. And also, despite the change of administration in the US and the official distancing themselves from the declaration, but we still see that the anti-SRHR Geneva Consensus Declaration, initiated on the Trump administration, is being used to gain more support. And recently, Guatemala and Russia joined the declaration. So the pushback is still there. And I think this panel today shows also that it feels like a call to action. And I'm happy that the Netherlands will definitely take part in that. But it's extremely worrying and the trends are not looking good. And I think we jointly need to push back the pushback. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. We'll move to Reem. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm really, really happy to be here. As many of you know, in fact, the gender-based violence against persons of diverse gender identities and sexual orientations is one of my priorities for the next 3 years of my mandate. And I think there's no better way than to be part of this collective effort, as Pascal said, to push against the pushback on this. And I want to also congratulate you, Victor, for a really informative set of reports that I found very timely, that I found very necessary, and actually very courageous and principled in their clarity, more than other things, and the clarity of the concepts that they set to define. So also not repeating what has been said, I mean, we know that gender, of course, is a system of hierarchy where power is provided to those who subscribe and enact toxic forms of masculinity and patriarchy, and that therefore it permeates all aspects of our life and society, because those who want to prescribe a certain gender approach want to ensure and continue to ensure a system of domination. So they want to therefore push an anti-gender discourse that will use whatever means of control that it has available, whether it's education, whether it's legislation, use of public opinion, use of religion and belief, etc. So yeah, whereas in the past, the term gender, as I think Victor mentioned, was a cornerstone of international human rights. Now it's being misrepresented as a term through which a whole ideology, the so-called gender ideology, is being imposed on countries and individuals. And these anti-gender movements, of course, attack feminist and LGBTI movements alike. They fight against women on the pretext that their biology predetermines their fate, and that the biology of women should determine how they should exist in the world, or not at all if they contravene that. And of course, equally, when it comes to LGBT persons in many countries, it's the same principle. As Mauro said, there is the idea that is promoted that LGBT persons can be redeemed because it's not natural to be LGBT. And if they cannot be redeemed, then they too are at serious risk of losing their lives. I think, as Pascal mentioned, for me, the most, let's say, obvious example of this pushback is indeed the Istanbul Convention and what is happening to the Istanbul Convention. I think she summarized it very well, so I will not repeat that, except to say that it is the most emblematic and problematic example that I think that we have. And furthermore to that, we also see a very big pushback against the access of women and girls to sexual and reproductive rights, often brought in and introduced through really questioning and altering entire legal protective systems, even in countries which have established legal systems and democracies. So with attempts to restrict the right to abortion, and also attacks on gender equality and sexuality education, like, for example, by closing gender studies programs and so on. Thank you.
Great. Everyone's been so amazing with the time. We're going to leave us enough time for one more round with the panelists. And, going towards the more, the examples which illustrate the importance of the cross-movement work or the alliance building in spheres in countering the anti-gender and anti-democracy forces. So maybe we'll begin with you, Reem, go the other way. Any examples that come to mind that you can share would be really useful. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I do agree that building alliances, first of all, is important because we know, as Victor said, that there's multiple interlocking dimensions of oppression and discrimination based on gender, but that can also intersect with oppression and discrimination on other grounds like class, like ethnicity, disability. So therefore, there are these two aspects of the concept of gender that are worth highlighting is basically gender, how it's experienced through social structures and norms, which produce unequal positions for women, for example. And it also refers to a continuum of individual experience and expression. And the two are very linked, I think. They don't need to be opposed to each other. And therefore, being a woman, for example, that lives outside the heteronormative gender framework, this kind of life, she will be experiencing different types of violence and discrimination in societal systems that preconceive and impose specific roles to persons according to their sex assigned at birth. Now, there are different ways in which they can, in which we can build alliances in which we need to work together. And one of these is, as I mentioned, this whole issue of the fight on, access to reproductive rights, given that it tries to restrict the autonomy that women and girls have over their bodies, and also to make decisions over reproductive health issues. There's the whole also issue of attacks against human rights defenders, because what we see is that human rights defenders and also persons who defend gender equality also by extension often defend LGBTI rights, and therefore it's sort of like a common cause, if I may call it. And then last but not least, I think we still have to do quite a bit, or we can do still quite a bit in bringing on board and working with faith-based institutions, faith actors. Well, first of all, because faith and religion should not be justified as a ground to deny anyone their basic human rights, but also because many LGBT persons also care about their faith like others, and have a right to also be part of faith traditions. And therefore, there's quite a lot of room in order to ensure that faith or religion is not used to undermine that right. And finally, I think that the fact that we continue to highlight also the advances and the progress that is made by states and non-state actors to ensure that LGBT persons can live their lives in dignity and equality and be free from violence is very important. So having someone, for example, like the government of Argentina speaking to that, for example, today is very important, because it shows that there are no excuses. If the political will is there to uphold human rights standards, then it can and it has to be done. Apologies for the very long interventions.
No, thank you. That was a very specific and really great example. Pascal, can we go to you next about any specific examples which illustrate the importance of this work?
Yeah, I think referring to your question, and my sound wasn't really great, but I assume it's the questions that we prepared for. So to give some concrete examples,
Yes.
I think it's first of all, it's good to recognize the historical fact that feminist and LGBTI movements have not always been supportive of each other. If you look at the 1970s, when transgender liberation movements and LGBT inclusion movements were starting to gain momentum, the alliances with feminist movements were lost in many countries. And even though feminist, transgender, and gay activists were striving for similar progressive ideals at the time. So it's really important that we keep the movements together. I think in the 70s, the feeling amongst these different activist groups was that if the other group attention, it would divert from their own cause. And that's, I think, still something that we have to be careful of. That jointly you can make as much impact. And maybe I always say to my kids who don't understand that, but 1 and 1 is 3. If you combine the causes and the impact, you can make much more noise and a much bigger impact. So it's not a zero-sum game that it was perceived to be, and it sometimes still is perceived to be. So I think it's something that we all need to take at heart. Maybe looking back, because I always believe that in history there are lessons that we can learn from that. So, for example, if you look at the 70s again, feminist transphobia and anti-transgender discourse with feminist communities was very real. And this moves away from cross-movement cooperation, or this move away from cross-movement cooperation has demonstrably slowed the progress for equal rights for LGBTI process. So if feminist and LGBTI movements would have joined forces already a long time ago in difficult decades for everybody at the time, they would have both benefited. So I think you can tell from history that if you go for your own cause and if you don't find the partnerships, then actually you could hamper each other, and at least you will slow down the process, or you will take away the speed of the process. And the mistrust, and also maybe the not knowing, was only repaired in the 1990s. So, and I still think, to be very completely honest, we are still overcoming some of those misunderstandings. And I'm happy that now, at least in many developed countries, we are at the stage of trans-positive and LGBTI inclusive feminism and vice versa. And I think it's really, really important that we will not let go of those groups and those corporations, because I think we know that there is not such a thing as a rivalry on these important issues of inequality. We are on the same team fighting for justice. And we have a much better understanding right now of how we can amplify each other's messages. And I believe they call this the millennial wave of feminist and LGBTI activism. It's all about the win-win mindset. And I think also, as a second example, if we are not aligned within the team, we are making it too easy for our actual rivals to win the game. Because it's not a coincidence that the countries that are anti-feminist, anti-gender, and anti-LGBTI, they're pretty much the same. So on the one hand, it's really good that it's on the highest political agenda, but it's not a coincidence, because it is about equality and it is about power. In those countries, we also see an anti-democratic movement. So it's something to be really wary about. Some of my colleagues call it the canary in the mine. It's the first thing that it has a discussion, and it's really, really tricky. So looking to the future, I think we have much to gain for looking where our priorities overlap. We have to join forces, especially within the multilateral space, to counter the anti-gender and anti-LGBTI pushback that we are seeing. Because our rivals have a very clear negative agenda. So it's really important to stay together and to have a positive agenda, even though sometimes it's frustrating and tiring, but I mean, there's just no option of giving up. So I think actually we should probably organize ourselves better than we do now. And we should focus on our common positive agenda and amplify the messages. It's events like these that we can feed that momentum and the awareness about the importance of linking feminism and the fight for the LGBTI community. And as I said before, I think the Netherlands is really in favor of that, but we need all voices and all powers, because it's not an easy fight.
Yes, definitely not an easy fight. Alba, can I go to you next, please?
Muchas gracias nuevamente. Muy buenos días a todos. En la primera parte yo quería establecer justamente los grandes logros y el aporte de los movimientos sociales para la democracia que vivimos para las personas LGBT. Sin embargo, el desafío que tenemos creo que justamente tiene que ver en un momento histórico en el que nos encontramos con la creación del Ministerio de las Mujeres, Géneros y Diversidad, a partir de lo que significa traducir todas esas agendas en políticas públicas. Esto creo que va a llevar, por supuesto, un tiempo en el desarrollo, pero también creo que es uno de los aportes para, digamos, que vengo a hacer en torno al trabajo que se debe hacer, con la responsabilidad del Estado que se debe llevar adelante. En ese punto, a mí me gustaría recuperar dos aspectos que, sin embargo, están desde mi rol y desde el lugar en donde trabajo, también viendo como aspectos que tienen que con la historia tenemos que ir observando y modificando. La Ley de Identidad de Género, aprobada en el año 2012, permite el reconocimiento de las identidades de las personas travestis y trans sin ningún criterio de judicialización y en virtud de lo que significa el libre desarrollo personal. De ahí es que justamente decía que el dato de las identidades no binarias es una consecuencia de la ley también de identidad de género en Argentina. Sin embargo, quisiera traer dos aspectos a observar. Por un lado, el marco normativo de la ley permitió también en ese mismo año el reconocimiento de un agravante dentro del Código Penal, que es justamente una de las herramientas, leyendo y trayendo el documento que el experto independiente generó, justamente en contra del odio por motivos de género, ¿no? El artículo 80, inciso 4, es el que habla justamente, digamos, como agravante de las muertes que tengan que ver con esa base en el odio de género a la orientación sexual, a la identidad de género o su expresión. Ese paso que fue tan positivo se pudo poner en implementación en Argentina a partir de una situación, de un caso, un travesticidio de una compañera, Amancay Diana Zacayán, en el año 2000, en la sentencia del año 2019. Es el agravante que reconoce la figura del travesticidio. Sin embargo, 2 años más tarde, la Cámara que analiza ese fallo quita de esa sentencia el reconocimiento a la identidad de género. La importancia de poder no solamente registrar nuestros nombres, pero también la trama de condiciones de vida que vivimos las personas LGBTIQ+, es fundamental para el reconocimiento de una justicia que rompa con los discursos de odio. Muchos de los modos en los que vivimos también constituyen los modos en los que nos matan o en el que morimos. Y este es justamente un debate que todavía en el ámbito judicial se sigue llevando adelante, y creo que la atención y la responsabilidad de nuestros estados en este momento tiene que focalizarse en una práctica constitutiva y a lo largo del tiempo que permita que ese reconocimiento se traduzca realmente, efectivamente, en la trama judicial de cada uno de los expedientes, en donde involucra no solamente los crímenes por prejuicio, por odio, por discriminación, los travesticidios, los transfemicidios, sino también en la trama judicial en donde somos víctimas de los ataques, pero también somos acusados por justamente, digamos, quedamos criminalizados a partir de lo que es un proceso acusatorio. Lo que quiero traducir con esto es que la atención para poder trabajar también en contra de los discursos de odio tiene que ver con una justicia que reconozca nuestra identidad de género. Yo creo que ese es uno de los enormes desafíos institucionales, sabiendo que el ámbito judicial es la última ratio para el proceso democrático en nuestros países. Y este es uno de los puntos significativos que todavía hoy constituyen uno de los desafíos. Digo porque me parece que justamente en torno a las políticas públicas se puede ahondar y profundizar, sobre todo en revertir las condiciones de vida de las personas LGBTIQ+, sino también creo que efectivamente hay desafíos más grandes, culturales, sociales, que involucran la responsabilidad de otros poderes, como el Poder Judicial, para el reconocimiento. Por eso hablaba de una justicia transfeminista. Este es el aporte que quisiera traer, que es justamente una transversalidad de la temática que involucra a toda nuestra sociedad. Y creo que ahí tenemos agenda para largo, porque realmente creo que hace falta trabajar profundamente todavía en Argentina, en Latinoamérica, para la democratización de nuestros derechos en términos de acceso a la justicia. Muchas gracias.
Great, thank you. Alba Mauro, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will try to be slow and brief. We'll see how it goes. First, I want to be a bit like disobedient, and I want to acknowledge a couple of things. One is that since the beginning of this event, we have had people making anti-gender, anti-trans comments on the chat, on the questions, on the title live, and the moderation had made a great job at keep that quiet. But being a panelist, I have had the chance of reading them. And I want to say that like I am old and have seen different waves of anti-trans organizing, but I also want to acknowledge that because as a trans person myself, it's not easy to participate in a conversation on human rights, having our community being constantly attacked, and that is happening in different events. I'm not advocating for censorship, but I am advocating for care. And especially regarding to allies, to know that when trans people are here participating in these kinds of events, we are exposed to that violence. And that violence is become naturalized as part of what it means to be a trans person. So we can add that to the definition of what a trans person is. A trans person is someone that go to a human rights panel and get attacked all the time by cis people. So moving to the next thing, I think that because we have been together in these fights for forever, and even have to reconstruct how trans, gender diverse, intersex people, LGBTI people in general, and cis feminists can be allies is to, it seems like, to forget our long trajectory of cooperation on and coalitions and wins in key areas. And it also means that we are forgetting, and I'm not talking about the people in this conversation, but many times, in debates in social media or political movements, that there is an epidemic, and it's an epidemic of gender violence. And all of us, like people like us in these conversations, we are the victim of that epidemic and not the perpetrators. And the perpetrators in general are cis men. Why we are not talking about the problem of cis men's violence against all of us, when we have to come back to see if being a trans person is dangerous to cis women, when trans people and cis women are facing the same problem with gender violence, it's still a mystery to me. I believe that what Gita said at the beginning, when you talk about these attacks being connected to attack to democracy, is exactly like that. And I have to say it right now that I believe that we are going to win, but the problem is how and when our systems of rights are going to be when we get there, because what we are seeing is a shrinking in human rights, but especially in sexual and reproductive rights. And in that regard, cis women and trans women and all, the LGBTI spectrum, are women in their entire own spectrum are at the same position or seen on sexual and reproductive rights under threat around the world. And again, it's not about trans women putting cis women's sexual and reproductive rights at risk. It has to do with other kind of institutional gender violence against all of us. Finally, I believe that we are all on the same boat. We are seeing that it's attacks seems to be particularly focused on gender, but when we pay attention to the rhetoric, we see that what is at stake is difference itself, or the value of difference. There is a very strong anti-migrant and racist rhetoric against this, in these debates. Is the fear of people that look different, speak different, come from a different life trajectory, and our future, as subject of human rights, it's at stake. Finally, if we are looking, or if you're here are looking for an opportunity to build a strong alliance on a theme that can unify us at all, I invite you to work with intersex movement. Intersex people are being mutilated around the world because we born with variations of sex anatomies. That's gender violence, and is the way in which our culture is imposing bodily standards. LGBT and cis feminist movement can come together, to change what is happening with intersex genital mutilation around the world. So if you're looking for a cause that we can all address together, I invite us to join us.
Yes, thank you, Mauro. We do need this reminder all the time. And I can't help but say that, yes, to achieve gender equality, we need human rights for all. And to achieve human rights for all, we need democracy. And then for true democracy, we need the participation of LGBTI people in decision-making at all levels. And, we are beginning to use this term for all structurally excluded people to be able to freely and safely exercise and demand their rights, and that's where, intersectionality, maybe not necessarily through an identity framework, but also through movement framework, becomes really important. We have about 10, 12 minutes left. So let's move to the questions. I know Mauro has typed some answers already, so we've reduced some questions. But I'm going to ask Subha maybe to read one of the questions that she's been monitoring, and then maybe we can begin with Victor, because I see some questions were asked, maybe the bundle of questions, and then we can use the remaining time if anyone else wants to pick up on some of the other questions. So Subha, can you read the question, and then Victor, you can answer it? Yeah. I want to try and answer at least 4 to 5 questions since we have about 10 minutes. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. So I think if we were to direct a question to Victor, I think the one that would be good to get your insight on would be the one about the Holy See. There was a really excellent question about the sort of anti-gender attacks that's being leveled by the Holy See within the UN system. And, just any insight on that from you, I think would be helpful.
Thank you very much. It's, of course, not only an interesting question, but also a provocative question in the sense that it provokes a great deal of thought about the strategic elements in all of this work that we are describing, and that on one hand appears to rely on characterizations of the furtherance of rights as dangerous for people, and on the other hand, aim at creating the, in the words of the wonderful Cynthia Rothschild, the active shrinking of spaces in which we operate. So while I was preparing this report, and there is a particular quote from the Holy See policy on gender and gender education, which I found really puzzling as to why this would be the time in history that the Holy See would see it fit to actually issuing a policy called "And Male and Female, He Created Them." And it clearly is a policy that underlines the idea that there are two molds, two very, very determined molds upon which every human being on earth needs to fall, one or the other, or be determined to be cut in pieces or assigned pieces so as to fit in them. The policy appears to underline and further the idea that according to these two molds, we will have a role in life. It would actually be a role of domination or a role of caring, both of them presented in positive terms, but in my view, not necessarily listening to what Mauro was alluding to, which is the very real reality of what we have learned from people with lived experience about the manner in which they seek, in other words, we all seek to reach fulfillment for life, and we have a right to seek fulfillment through life. In reality, that policy that I quoted, and of which I am constructively critical, let's speak, embodies ideas that are put at the service of the ultimate objective of policing people's bodies. And by the policing of their bodies, these are the words of the wonderful Tlaleng Mokopang, the Special Rapporteur on Right to Health, by policing their bodies, ensuring that we actually fall neatly into a sphere of control where the policing also has an impact in relation to the way we exercise our rights. It has then, of course, intimate connection, no pun intended, with the realities expressed by Reem about the whole connectivity of this agenda with the furtherance of the principles of bodily autonomy, all principles related to bodily autonomy, and the instrument of comprehensive sexual education, which of course, as we all know, is something that is under fire very much by these quarters. And then I have to say, added to that, the dimensions expressed by Alba in relation to the way that we need to give consequence to these issues in internal policy, in internal access to justice, and in lawmaking, and the external alliances reflected by Pascal in her presentation when she spoke of the realities about political and regional reality. Pascal extrapolated all of the realities of the Istanbul Convention, but this is the same situation in the Americas with the Convención de Belém do Pará, where, as we know, there is now great questioning of these issues at the inter-American level, and where we also need to be very much mindful of. Gita, I would just like to make two more sentences. One of them relates to the expressions related by Mauro. I think that it is very important that we know that there is an international law framework that, from the level of legal analysis, creates a link to the very real, everyday reality that Mauro was making reference to, and that I also wish to acknowledge and respect. And that is, hate speech is recognized under the Rabat Plan of Action, under the Secretary General's political framework, and under the UN strategy as speech that relies and reproduces stigma and creates and wishes to perpetuate notions on peoples based on their belonging to a particular group or on the basis of our particular characteristic. It is any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis of who they are. Now, we may have then conversations about what type of hate speech gets to be criminal in nature. And that's, of course, a technical discussion. But what we need to acknowledge is that all forms of communications in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or use pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to persons or groups on the basis of who they are, that is considered to be hate speech under UN standards. And of course, I am making a strong call that as part of the care that we owe to each other and the respect that we need to our spaces, we need to be vigilant to ensure that we create, maintain, and further spaces that are free of hate. Hate cannot have a role in our work. And on this, I will finish by saying, of course, I think building bridges, it's an important part. And we also need to acknowledge, I believe, once we acknowledge the strength and the robustness of our standing point, I want to acknowledge that there may be people that are worried, there may be people that have questions, there may be people that have been part of historical struggles that do not necessarily know how to handle the changes that challenging the binary may represent. And to them, of course, and I think to everybody who in good faith wants to have a respectful, thoughtful discussion about how we further the human rights for all, of course, the doors of the mandate are open, absolutely open, but ensuring that we are not having the intent of harming or spreading hate. That is absolutely the limit to the mandate and what we will not, of course, be supportive of in any way, shape, or form. Geeta, thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay, we have 5 minutes left. I know it's less time because of the technical issues we had. So what I want to do is maybe let Subha ask, just what the lines of questioning have been, and then let you all, take a minute and just say what may be most important in your head in response. So Subha, can you just in summary, ask what some of the questions have been?
Sure. So I think there's a really interesting question specifically put in here about the UK, but I think we could make it generally about sort of contradictions between what we see happening domestically in certain countries and how those states are then presenting themselves as allies in international policy space, right? While persecuting LGBTI people in the country. So maybe that's something folks could respond to. Mauro, I think there's a really good question that might be best for you about how in some contexts, LGBTI people are construed as a Western phenomenon, when we know that actually many anti-LGBTI laws are actually colonial history. So how can we respond effectively to those claims? And finally, I think how do we respect and understand gender as a spectrum, of course, and move away from binaries and identities, but while, of course, maintaining pressure on the fact that some people are subject to human rights abuses, while others are not, on the basis of how they are located on the spectrum. Thank you.
So who wants to begin? Just a minute to say something. If I see a hand, I'll just go with. Okay, Pascal, why don't you begin? And then Reem, Alba.
Yeah, to be very honest, I find it difficult to comment on the UK, who's a great ally on many issues. So I don't think it's for me to speak on. And I think actually also the two other questions are not really geared towards me. So
okay,
I give my time to other people.
Okay, Reem, do you want to take?
Yeah, I also may say something that is perhaps obvious, but just like when it comes to violence against women and girls, I mean, it requires an all-society approach. It requires a transformative approach, comprehensive, because the problem is a manifestation of deeper structural human rights and other issues meshed with so many, structural inequalities and problems. So any one intervention on its own will not, will not change this. Yeah.
Great. Alba, Mauro, a minute? Mauro, do you want to go? I'll stop you after a minute. No. You're on mute, Mauro.
Alba, ¿quieres primero?
Solamente para decir que creo que la pregunta también apunta a las alianzas en términos a los movimientos sociales y feministas. Y de lo que estamos hablando en definitiva es quién es el sujeto de representación dentro de los feminismos y los transfeminismos. Yo quisiera abordar desde ahí también este planteo. Lo digo porque hace poco estuve por suerte, la oportunidad de reaccionar sobre unos libros que Judith Butler habló, digamos, en los años 90, y me parece que desde entonces hasta aquí tenemos realmente un recorrido que habla de alianzas transfeministas a partir de lo que significa los recorridos de nuestros territorios. En Latinoamérica, el valor territorial se da muchas veces para sumar sujetos políticos que hablen de pluralidad de voces. Las personas LGBTIQ+, somos partes de esas agendas políticas. Sin duda, creo que esto tiene que tener y tiene alianzas, sobre todo para romper las desigualdades económicas, sociales y culturales. El sujeto político del transfeminismo es un sujeto plural que habla de estas intersecciones. Ese es el aporte que creo que justamente el recorrido de los movimientos sociales en Latinoamérica. Por supuesto, en un contexto de profundas violencias, tal como se menciona, y creo que hay que desagregar, digamos, cada una de ellas como responsabilidades, pero si tuviese que pensar en agendas políticas, me parece que los sujetos políticos del feminismo y de los transfeminismos tienen que ser plurales, porque así se constituyeron en voces plurales que hablan de recorridos, donde efectivamente nuestros derechos se han visto mejorados en la pluralidad no solamente de las voces y el reconocimiento de nuestras historias, sino también en las alianzas y en la estrategia frente a la violencia machista y patriarcal. Eso quería comentar. Gracias.
Thank you, Amber. Mauro?
I have just two comments. One is that decolonization needs to be a key approach in this work, and of course there will be positions saying that in this country or this region they're not LGBTI people because that's not the traditional name. I have the impression that we are paying too much attention to what's going on with denominations, including, you know, this debate, like if gender is a system of oppression, and then what is gender identity? If gender identity is identifying with the system of oppression, like gender identity is another name for identity. And gender means many different things. We can find out the right kind of meanings that we need. But again, I believe it's basically about human rights, and particularly about sexual and reproductive rights. And that should be the key issue at stake. There's been several questions asking about how to build alliances, what to do with people being rejected or not being included in certain spaces. And again, I believe that it's not about the definition, about what is a woman and how we define, like what are the boundaries, but about the boundaries itself, like how we allow people that is look the same as us, but also that are different than us. What we do with difference in what we consider to be our territory. If we believe in plurality of bodies, of identities, of voices, or we believe in singularity and in sameness. For me, that's like the key, a key aspect of the conversation. Finally, I don't want to focus on the UK, but in general on ally countries working on LGBTI issues. This is the moment when the formula doesn't work anymore, like the acronym LGBTI. There is not such a thing as an LGBTI friendly country. The countries that are more they're friendlier with LG people, others that are friendlier with trans people. It depends. And if a country wants to be acknowledged as an LGBTI friendly country, it needs to have good laws and policies on LGBTI issues in general. Otherwise, we have countries where people can get married, for example, with whatever, whoever they want, but at the same time they have strong limitations in their very right to identity. That country can't have the acronym of an LGBTI country. In terms of the I, and sorry for coming back to intersex, in terms of the AI, most countries of the world are not defending the rights of intersex people. So when you call themselves LGBTI, please do that, but put the actions, where the I is, because we need more LGBTI friendly countries. Thanks.
Yeah, that is really, I think, a powerful way to end the session. I am sad that we have to end because we have still a lot of discussion we could have, but it's the beginning, it's a beginning of coming together as different actors where we are speaking through different lenses, contexts. And I'm not going to make any closing remarks because I think all of you, the remarks have been made. Everybody, thank you so much for being on the panel, for Victor to share with us, the report and your comments. We hope that the answers that have also been answered in the chat have been read by the participants. And we hope this is the beginning of many such conversations. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you panelists. Thank you, Victor, the interpreters, the organizers. Pleasure to be in this with you all. Bye, everyone.